thank you to those of you who've already sent me your exam schedule. A reminder to everybody else, if you could please send that to me, if at all possible, by Thursday, so I can sit down and start to figure out what would work with everybody's schedule. That would be great. Thank you. Okay, so we are now moving on to the next segment of the course, and where we are going to spend probably most of the time up until spring break, and that is the law. So we've talked about secondary sources, what I fondly like to call stuff to help you find the law, and now we're actually going to finally dive into the law. So we're going to start with a basic introduction. Now I know that you all have, or we all have learned some of this way back in maybe 9th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, but just as a reference point, that article that we talked about in the first class, Top 10 Things Librarians Wish New Associates Would Know, right up there on number 1 is Know the Basics, Civics 101, how a law bill becomes a law, where regulations come from. So we're going to sort of get some context today. It's going to be review somewhat. It's also going to dive into some things I think probably you haven't encountered before. And what we are going to use is this chart that hopefully everybody has a copy of, Sources of the Law. Now, looking at it, you might think, oh, this isn't so complex. Why do we need to spend so much time on it? And I would probably agree with you. It's not overly complex, but the chart turns out to be quite densely packed with a lot of separate pieces, but related pieces of information that you will need to know moving forward as we investigate the law. So as I said, we're going to start today with the basics of getting to know the chart and the foundations of the sources of the law, and then for the latter part of class we will dive into the first area of the law that we're going to discuss, and that's going to be statutes. Okay, so on this chart, and I have it up here, you have handout. By the way, the links of the two handouts you have are on the course website under handouts. Actually, the sources of the law is a web link because this is, as you can see, also a web page. Okay, so how is the chart constructed? Basically, the first column is going to tell you what you're going to be looking at in the second and third columns. And obviously the second column talks about federal sources, and the third column talks about New York State and the municipalities created by New York State. So you can see the third column has two parts to it. Okay, in terms of the rows, that's going to be the highlight. So as you can see, the first row, we talk about how is the government established? And of course, we all know the Constitution establishes, the federal Constitution establishes the federal government. Articles 1, 2, and 3 establish the three branches. Likewise, no shock of shocks, the New York Constitution establishes the New York government. Interesting, what you may not have known, and we'll be talking about municipal law as a whole later on in the semester, but it is a source of the law, so it's included here. In the municipal world, so the state creates municipalities, and the form of government in that municipality is established by a municipal charter. So you may have seen referenced to the New York City Charter, perhaps to the Nassau County Charter. There are different areas of different municipalities that govern, and sometimes they are overlapping. For instance, we are in the town of Hempstead right now. We are also in Nassau County. There is a government of the town of Hempstead with a charter establishing that government, as well as Nassau County. I live in Long Beach, which is not in the town of Hempstead, but is in Nassau County. So if I need to figure out who to call to get my street plowed, I need to wade through figuring out all of those overlapping jurisdictions. And again, for all of those municipalities, their government is established by the municipal charter. Okay, so as we mentioned, the Constitution establishes, at least for the federal and state, the three branches we've all learned about: legislative, executive, judicial. So of course on the federal end, legislative is of course the House and Senate. Anybody know the legislative bodies for New York? Not a trick question. I haven't told you already, I don't do trick questions.
Senate and Assembly.
Senate and Assembly, yeah, see, okay. like I said, no trick questions. Okay, for municipal, it tends to be a city council. Nassau County is the county legislature. The naming tends to be a little bit funky or variable, I should say, when it comes to municipalities. You have to kind of go with the flow a little bit on the names. Okay, so that's the legislative branch. Executive branch. So in the federal end, the executive branch, of course, we have the President of the United States. What's the other part of the executive branch that the President nominally directs, but he actually appoints people to direct?
Agencies.
Agencies. So did you all take admin? Okay, so you got into the APA and all the administrative procedure. So one source of the law is all of the promulgations and how all that takes place that you learned in admin. So the agency regulations is another source of the law. Similarly, in the state, you have the executive, the governor, and of course you have state agencies also that promulgate regulations. On the municipal end, you may or may not have an executive. One day I have to check this out. I'm not sure if Long Beach, if we actually have an executive. I know we have a Long Beach City Council that legislates and passes laws. Don't know if we have an executive, but of course New York City does. Mayor de Blasio, hear a lot about him in the news. We have a town supervisor in Hempstead. There's a Nassau County Executive Mangano. And the municipalities also may or may not have agencies, depending on the size and how they're structured, and those agencies may or may not promulgate regulations that we can find. It tends to be more the larger municipalities like New York City. Okay, and of course, last and arguably least, only for my purposes at this very moment, the judicial branch, and arguably least only because it requires the least discussion, because you've all got a sense of what judges do since you've been reading cases for the last 2 or 3 years. We will be going into detail in terms of cases and researching cases, but again, later on, probably next month, later on. Okay, so that's essentially the overall structure of government. Let's take a look at the actual, where we're going to find the law. I will say published, even though that sort of has a print connotation, but obviously online as well. So let's start again with the legislative branch. And of course, Congress, or the state legislature, as we know from the Constitution, passes the laws. Pretty straightforward. When these laws are first passed, obviously a legislature meets and they pass whatever laws they're going to pass, and when they meet, that's called a legislative session. I don't know, you've heard the terminology before. That is relevant only because when the legislature passes a law and it's signed by the executive, the generic name for what they produce is called a session law, because again, the legislature sits for a session. A session can last 1 year, a session might last 2 years, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So given that we are talking about a point in time where something happens, these session laws basically get compiled chronologically. So if a session lasts for 1 year, the session that just finished last year for 2014 will be compiled in the 2014 volume of session laws for, say, the New York State Legislature. So looking over, so that's our description. So looking over in the chart under the federal column, the way that works in the federal world, and what it's called in the federal world, is when Congress, the House and Senate vote, they pass the bill, they send it to the president signs it. What is produced is called a public law. Now this is where the naming, the nomenclature becomes important, because you're going to see references to public laws, abbreviated PL, as you can see, in a lot of different places, and you want to understand what that is. That is a generic session law passed at a particular point in time that has become the law. And when I say passed, I mean passed and signed. If it's passed and vetoed, then it's not a law, obviously. Okay, and actually, let's first, before I get ahead of myself, take a look at what a public law might look like. me just, oh, sorry about this, scroll up. So here is, now I'm looking at the PDF of a public law to provide pension reform, excuse me. And this act may be cited as Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. Guess what? This is our friend ERISA, which was initially passed in 1974. If you hadn't noticed that in some of the other things we were looking at in all the secondary sources, now you see it. So this is what an act actually looks like as it was initially passed, as I said, in 1974. Okay, you will find all of these public laws, including ERISA, officially published in this tome known as Statutes at Large. We have a little bit of show and tell today. Why do we care about this old, heavy, dusty tome? Well, in part because what you are looking at when you look at public laws is statutes at large. Notice what's up here, 88 STAT. STAT is the abbreviation, as you'll see on the handout in the little legal abbreviations table below the main table. You'll see the abbreviations. STAT stands for statutes at large. So when you see that reference, which you will see a lot online all over the place because that is the official site to a public law, you will now know that's statutes at large. Okay, so that's one reason why you care about these old-fashioned. I very much doubt on that. Well, you can put your hands on it now if you're interested, but I very much doubt after class today you'll have much cause to put your hands on the old-fashioned dusty tome. You'll see I have tabbed where in volume 88 STAT you will find our friend ERISA, and of course it starts on page 829 because we can see that up here. Another place you will find federal public laws, those session laws as they were passed by Congress, signed by the President, is an unofficial, big, fat, heavy, dusty tome called U.S. Code Congressional and Administrative News. And hopefully that will be the last time I say that this semester because we will call it USCAN, which is what everybody else calls it, how it's abbreviated and how it's cited to, and that is the Blue Book form, USCCAN. So this is the unofficial source. West Publishing actually publishes this, as opposed to the U.S. government that publishes the official. And there were a whole bunch of reasons back in the old days before the web why West Publishing got into the publishing game of something the government gives away for free. And that is because they could add value and make money. You will still see USCAN on Westlaw. Of course, you won't see it on Westlaw and Bloomberg for I hope are obvious reasons. But you'll still encounter USCAN. As I said, it will be useful for a variety of reasons we'll talk about later on in the semester on Westlaw. You will also see lots of citations to it in law review articles. Because of these added features that West added to USCAN, scholars still cite to it. Sometimes judges still cite to it in cases, if for whatever reason they want to cite to the other material in USCAN in addition to the public laws. And I can't say for certain they don't even cite to the public laws in USCAN, even though they're also officially in statutes at large. So you can do some weightlifting with that one as well if you like. But in USCAN, in terms of the public law portion, the text you will see is identical. Public law for ERISA. USCAN's organized a little bit differently. Instead of given a random volume number and a page, like we see 88, ERISA was passed in 1974. It just happened to be volume 88 of Statutes at Large. There's no connection. You just have to know the volume number and obviously the page. USCAN doesn't bother with volume numbers. They go by year. So you have to know the year of your public law if you want to find it in USCAN. So we have to know 1974. Okay. So now, hopefully you're starting to understand the logic behind the chart. Let's take a look at the legislative branch, for the state. So, what would a session law passed by the Assembly and Senate and signed by the government be called in New York State? Take a look at the chart. Chapter law. Everybody see where chapter law is listed? Everybody see how it goes across? I tried to line it up as best I could. And where would we find chapter laws published? What old, dusty, heavy tome? Again, in the chart. This isn't natural knowing, not yet.
McKinney's?
McKinney's what?
Session law.
McKinney's session laws. And it's not in the chart, but you might be able to guess this one. How is a chapter law abbreviated? Or what's the abbreviation for chapter law? It's not in the chart. It's going to be in the next iteration. I realized after that would be a good thing to add. But anyway. CH. Okay, that's a little bit of natural knowing there. So when you see CH in reference to a New York, it's going to be most likely a chapter law. Okay, so the big, heavy, dusty tomes that you'll probably never put your hands on again for New York session laws, known as chapter laws, is McKinney's session laws. Okay, looking across, so we know that municipalities probably have legislative bodies that pass laws. What are those laws likely to be called? Again in the chart. Local laws. Again, I'm going into ridiculous detail with this chart because I actually firmly believe that it will help you as we start to go into a lot of nitty-gritty and detail to have this set forth and understand how the information is presented, so you can say, oh, what the heck was New York laws called again? And you can say, oh yeah, chapter laws. And again, that's my hope that will help you. And so let's go back to the chart here since I'm extolling its virtues so much. Okay, now here is now probably one of the key concepts in the course. Full stop. In the course. If you get this, you will understand just about everything you need to understand about statutes. You'll understand at least 25 to 50% of what gets really confusing about legislative history. You might even understand reading some newspapers and an occasional reference in a case. So hopefully I have your attention. What happens to, so here we have ERISA, passed in 1974, as you can see up on the screen. How do we know what sections of ERISA? Well, okay, let me take a step back. Do we think ERISA, as it was passed in 1974, exists exactly as stated in this 1974? No. What do we think happened? Okay. How do we know what sections stayed the same and what got amended? Maybe even several times, right? Because 1974 was a long time ago. And we might also notice in ERISA, and let me scroll back up, so we have a section about employee benefit rights. And if I scroll down a little bit, we have a section relating to the Internal Revenue Code. If I want to see all the changes up till today that happened to ERISA, do I need to look through every volume of statutes at large in every public law to see if any section changes? Obviously I don't. That's an impossible task, right? So we need to find a way to see what sections are in force today, right? And we also probably want to find a way to see those sections by some sort of topic arrangement. Employee benefits, Internal Revenue Code, at least. Maybe there are other sections in there. And that's obviously true for every public law. Now, some public law may only cover one area, but some probably cover more than just two. So what happens, and again, put this asterisk, red, highlight, bold, everything you can do in your notes. What happens is each section in a public law gets codified. Big, fancy word, or not so big, fancy word for put in subject arrangement. A possible analogy, you'll have to help me out on this one because I don't know how you do this. you have, what, you each take 3, 4 classes, maybe 5 if you're like to be really busy. And you have however many classes for each, meetings per week for each class. And you all probably take notes, maybe on your laptop, maybe if you don't like some of them. How do you organize them? My guess is you have a document for each class, or maybe a folder for each class where you put each class notes. Does that make sense? And you inform me. I mean,
Yeah, by subject and topic.
okay. So think of each class meeting as a session law. And think of your subject and topic, whether it's a folder, whether it's a file, as the codification. Does that feel like a fair analogy? And it's not going to go very far, this analogy, because obviously we're talking about very different things between statutes and your class notes. But I want to give you a sense of the purpose of codification and the importance of codification. If you just listed every class you met, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, to however many for 5 classes without any organization, you'd go nuts when you had to study for finals, right? So, same analogy as I suggested for figuring out what sections of the 1974 version of ERISA are still in effect, and how do we find them given that there are many different subjects covered, or at least a couple of different subjects covered by the original ERISA. So again, the fancy word for that is codification, or codified. Okay, so as you can see in our description column, John, do you have a set of handouts? There should be an extra one floating around. We're looking at the sources of the law chart.
Thank you.
So in our description column, under the legislative branch, the subject compilation. Actually, let me go back to the one online so the subject compilation of legislation currently in force is called a code. Kind of makes sense, codification code. You can start calling your class folders codes if you like. And so for the federal legislation, where will we find this code? In the set called?
For federal?
For federal.
U.S. code?
U.S. code. That might actually be something you've already encountered, and you can see it here on the chart. So United States Code is the official version published by the U.S. government, and there are a couple of unofficial sources of the code, USCA, USCS, and you can see what they stand for down here in legal abbreviations, U.S. Code Annotated, U.S. Code Service, U.S. Code Annotated published by Westlaw, U.S. Code Service published by Lexis. You can obviously not even have to guess what we will find on which service. And we will be talking a whole lot about annotated codes and why it is that, these publishers publish these unofficial versions and expect us to spend money on. And believe me, for the annotated code, they're worth every penny. In fact, I'm not even sure that the U.S. code is worth taxpayer money anymore. But we can have that discussion next time when we go more deeply into the code. Okay. So looking across, what would we call the codified version of New York laws? McKinney's. And in parentheses, because it's not its real name, how am I describing McKinney's?
Black colors.
Okay, so the reason for that, and you may find yourself, for whatever reason, not looking at New York statutes online, but actually having to use the old-fashioned books, so I'm hopefully going to dispel an area of frequent confusion for people using McKinney's. And I'll pass these around so you can see closer for yourself. So remember, we had McKinney's session laws. These are the chronologically arranged chapter laws, the session laws as they were passed by the legislature and Senate and signed by the governor. So I pulled out a random volume, 1991. So here are the session laws from 1991. And it says here on the spine, McKinney's session laws. Lawyers in New York have come to refer to the New York Code, where they look for the laws that are passed by the legislature. They just refer to it as McKinney's. It's just known as shorthand as McKinney's. The full name is McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York Annotated. God, no one's going to say all that, right? They're just going to say McKinney's. But what happens is people come looking for McKinney's. They say, oh, look, McKinney's. And they pull out the red volumes, which are the session laws. And they get thoroughly confused because the citation systems are totally different. Whereas the McKinney, what I call parenthesis black volume, if you look on the spine, it doesn't say McKinney's at all. It just has Public Health sections 4400 to end, or whatever volume, obviously, you happen to pull out. Obviously, you won't run into this problem if you are on Lexis or Westlaw, but if you are finding yourself using the print version, this might be a source of confusion, and it's also a good re-emphasis of the difference between the session laws and the code. So I'll pass these around together. Just look at this. If you want to look at something else, but the spine is the interesting part in my humble opinion. Okay, so as I said, key concept for the course: public laws, chapter laws, generically known as session laws, chronologically arranged, passed by the legislature. They get codified, put in subject arrangement. So both we can search by topic and codified so we can tell what's still currently in force. And that's what the code does for us. So we don't have to read through millions of pages to figure out what the actual law of ERISA is as it exists today. Okay, if you walk out understanding something today, that should be it. Okay. I should mention McKinney's is published by West. There is another version of the New York Code called CLS, Consolidated Law Service, which is obviously what we will find not on Westlaw, but on Lexis, because CLS is published by Lexis, does the same thing as the McKinney's black volume. And finally, well, not finally, but municipal code, I gave it away, darn it. Municipalities, they take their local laws that they pass every year, and they also put it in a code, since they already gave it away, I won't ask you, called an administrative code. That actually gets kind of confusing to people because administrative codes are also sometimes what regulations are called. So again, you need to be a little careful. So speaking of the executive branch, let's go down to the next row. So we already talked about the executive branch is both the president and the agencies. The president does actually produce his very own set of documents. You've probably been hearing in the news about executive orders, because President Obama has issued a few of those, some of which have been somewhat controversial, and we will be talking about executive orders and how to find them when we get to administrative materials. But mostly what we're going to focus on are what we already talked about that you learned about in your admin class, which is regulations. And as you will see, a similar pattern exists for regulations. Looking at our description when we're looking in the executive branch, there's a chronological publication of regulations, and that is called, looking at the chart,
Federal Register.
exactly. And in New York it's called?
New York State Register.
Yeah, they're frequently called registers. And the codification, again, the subject arrangement that tells us what regulations are currently in force on the federal end is called
Code of Federal Regulations.
Code of Federal Regulations. And if you want, and in New York,
LCRO.
absolutely. Now just be aware, it's, okay, again, I'm going to say that, well, maybe I'll say it again when we talk about administrative materials, but in New York, the regulations are published in the official compilation of the codes, rules, and regulations of the state of New York. more simply called NYCRR. Now, what's interesting about the NYCRR and that it's abbreviated that way is I can't tell you how many attorneys, mind you, they've graduated from law school sometimes a long time ago, asked me for the New York City rules and regulations. And having been a reference librarian for a whole lot of years, I have learned, you mean the NYCRR? Yeah. You want the state regulations, not the city regulations. It's easy to get confused. I'm not trying to make too much fun of them, but NYC usually stands for New York City, but when you see NYCRR, that's the state regulations. Okay, and as I mentioned, for municipalities, only the largest really have their agencies issue regulations that are then published so we as lawyers can find them somewhere. So the example, as you can see on the chart, the rules, the New York City publishes its rules. So you can find those for other municipalities. If their agencies do issue their rules, I'm not sure that you can find them published anywhere. You'd have to actually contact that particular agency. Municipal agency. Okay. Any question about our chart? Are we all comfortable with it and comfortable with the abbreviations and the names of the sources? Okay, good. So then we're going to play a little. And by play a little, I mean I'm going to ask you to log into Twen if you haven't already. And just by way of review, we're going to use the Instapoll, or customized polling, I guess Twen calls it these days, feature. So once you're logged into Twen, if you click on Customize Polling, what you will see, I know you can see other polls, we'll be doing these next time, so just pretend they're not there. We'll be doing the statute intro questions, since we're just in the intro portion, we're not quite ready for review yet. And what I'm going to ask you is to restrain yourself and only go with one question at a time and try to resist the temptation to peek ahead at the next question so that we can all look at it together and see where, if any, there are any sources of confusion. So everybody ready to go with our first poll? So poll number 1. So this is actually there are 2 questions in this particular poll. A session law in New York is called, and everybody click on the right answer. And then when you've done that, click on next and answer the second question, which is a federal session law is called. My bad. Ignore question 2. Good, good. And I wasn't meant to be a trick. After telling you I don't do trick questions. That's what I get for changing things. Okay, so let's finish poll. And let's view results. You can do it on your... Okay, so everybody got chapter law, and question 2 wasn't fair, so we're throwing that out. But a federal session law is called... Public law. Okay. So let's go to question 2. And again, a 2 question. A chapter law in New York. And pick the best choice. And then when you're ready, go to the next one. A public law, and again, everybody ready? Wave at me if you're not ready. Okay, so let's finish poll and see how we did. View results. Okay, so a chapter law in New York reflects the law when it was passed on a specific date. Absolutely. We only have 7 people voting. Who's sitting out?
I just signed in, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right.
I gotta change it. I forgot my Twitter password.
It's the same as your Westlaw password.
I mean, yeah, no, but when we change it, I just keep writing over.
Oh, okay, yeah, I can empathize with that one. All right, there's still 2 of you who are sitting out. I could go in and think I can actually go in the admin and look, but I'm not going to. So just step up and help your classmates, will you? Stop being a free rider. Okay, so question 2, a public law reflects the law as it exists today, reflects the law as the date it was passed. Okay, so although typically a poll is majority vote, these really do have right and wrong answers, but in this case the majority did actually vote for the right answer. So let me see if I can guess whoever it was. I'm not going to single anybody out. Was a little bit confused. Basically, again, the public law is the session law. So remember, we were looking at a public law from 1974, which is ERISA, employee retirement. So this particular public law, 93-406, and we'll talk about the numbering system next time, reflects the law on the date it was passed, not as it exists today. So whoever was a little confused, if you're still confused, ask your question and don't worry about it. That's why we're doing this. Okay, so
I just had a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned this, but so with the public law, the number that goes first is whichever Congress it is, but with the statutes at large, so for example, there said it was 88 stat. Does that 88 have any significance, or?
it's just the random volume of...
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be talking about the public law numbering system, which is actually
Oh,
fairly
fine.
informative. So sorry about that, but statutes at large, just 1974, however they've been compiling these, they got up to volume 88 by 1974. I don't know what volume we're up to now, 100 and something, I'm sure.
Gotcha.
So it's like the case reporters, it just...
Exactly. Good analogy. And again, the public law number has a particular significance, which we'll talk about. Okay. Let's go back to our customize polling. And I have a hunch it's going to make me click through again, but that's okay. Question 3. Again, a two-part question. Okay, so chapter laws appear in and then the next question, public laws are published in okay. Wave at me if you're not done. That's what I did wrong. Okay. Okay, so chapter laws appear in McKinney's session laws. Exactly. So as we see on our chart, we see chapter law, and we see our little parentheses, McKinney's session laws. Public laws are published in statutes at large, USCAN. Actually, both are correct.
What did you say was the difference with USCAN?
USCAN is unofficial,
Right?
published by Westcon. And West does that. Basically, we will be looking at USCAN when we talk about legislative history. What USCAN does is it publishes the public laws, and unlike statutes at large, which gives us random volume numbers, USCAN just gives us the year on the volume, which you can see on the volume I brought here. So if you wanted to take a look at my tab pages here, the public law that we're interested in from 1974, and again the number 93-406, we'll talk about later, is identical. USCAN is just unofficial. Okay, so let's go back to customize polling and do question 4. McKinney's that appear in the black volumes contains and then the next question when you're done with that. United States Code contains. Wave at me if you're still working. Okay, I see some waving. Still working? Okay. Okay, we still have a couple of shy people, but that's... So, McKinney's black volumes contain New York legislative sections currently in force, and U.S. Code contains federal legislation currently in force. We're all good. So the two of you who are rather shy, speak up or forever hold your peace if you've got any questions. Okay. So, question 4, just a couple more. And I know we're repetitive, but again, if you understand this and sort of internalize it, everything moving forward is going to make a lot more sense. So, McKinney's session laws are chronologically arranged by subject. And you're done with that. United States Code annotated is chronologically arranged by subject. Wave at me if you're still working. Okay. Wait a Okay, anybody still working? Let's finish the poll. View results. Okay, so McKinney's session laws are chronologically arranged. Absolutely. Everybody's good with that. United States Code annotated is. Okay, so looking at the chart, United States Code annotated, USCA, is listed under, or it's printed under, I'm going to go to the sources here. So we see USCA is under the United States Code. So this is a subject compilation of legislation currently in force. Okay, remember, the fancy word codified, anything means that the session laws, whenever they were passed on whatever date going back to 1789 for Congress and whenever New York State started passing laws, possibly, since we're an original state, possibly 1789, I'm not even sure about that. But anyway, so all those session laws going back, they got put in a code, and only the sections that are currently in force are in that code, and that code is arranged by subject. Again, so your class notes that you took back first day of class in January, that actual file is the session laws, but you put them into the class folder and possibly into a topic folder if you're very organized. And so well, I guess the currently in force for the class notes analogy doesn't quite work as I'm thinking through that. But anyway, for the code, for codified sections, if they are in the current code, then they are ones that are currently in force. Whoops, wrong one. Does that make sense to the So they're currently in force, so and they're subject arranged, so they're not chronologically arranged is the point in where a couple people got confused. You okay with that? Okay, and one more question on our poll workshop. Okay, and this is just a single question. McKinney's, the black volumes, are most like in function which of those? Statutes at large, U.S. Code annotated, also known as USCA, New York Supplement, McKinney's session laws, and USCAN. So I know this was a little mean, but this is like one of those LSAT analogy questions. Anybody still working? Okay. Excellent. That's good. I don't know why. At least when I took it, everybody hated those analogy questions. I don't know how you all felt. But, okay. Any questions? So a few sort of general things you want to remember about statutes generally before we dive into just federal. And again, so this is true about state as well as federal. Probably less so municipal because they just don't apply. And first is, think about preemption generally. Now, I know we're talking about ERISA preemption throughout the whole class, and that's one example of thinking about, all right, does federal law somehow preempt whatever's going on, I'm interested in going on, that may be also a state issue? Can anybody think of areas of law that federal law preempts state? Can you think of another area of law in addition to ERISA where a federal law is going to preempt whatever a state does?
Any federal regulations, treaties?
Well, treaties. The regulations depend, states can pass environmental regulations as well as federal, and it depends. It's possible that the federal regulation may trump or preempt the state. I don't know, would bankruptcy be
I don't think there is state bankruptcy law.
Probably just federal, and likewise copyright law, which is actually in the Constitution as well.
What is state debtor creditor law?
State
debtor creditor law, like New York has its own debtor creditor law.
in addition to the federal.
Right.
Probably what would happen, I don't know this, but my guess is if the state conflicted with the federal would preempt. So all I'm suggesting here is think about that. If you find a state debtor creditor law and think, okay, great, this is what applies, you want to think about, is there any federal law that I should be worrying about? And if there's a conflict, then you have some serious research to do about whether there are any cases that resolve that conflict or any regulations that might explain it. Okay, probably an obvious point to you all, but unlike cases where a New Jersey court might cite to a New York State court as persuasive, states really don't look to one another's statutes as persuasive. They might look to one another's statutes saying, hey, that's a great idea, and then enact it itself. But you don't really argue to a court or present in a memo, hey, New Jersey does that, so maybe it's likely in New York that that's the way things work. New York might someday adopt it, but not necessarily. You may also have dealt with some uniform or model laws. You probably talked about the model penal code and crim law. You might have talked about the UCC if you're talking about state creditor, consumer laws. These are uniform laws. What happens is this big multi-state organization, by multi-state I mean the different states send representatives, they sit down and they think about, okay, there are some areas of the law where it may just make sense for the states to have something similar, have similar rules in each state. Think about the UCC. If my brother who lives in New Jersey writes me a check, I want it to be cashed in New York. I don't want New York rules to say, oh, that's New Jersey, forget that. So the Uniform Law Commission has the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, and what's happened is all of the states adopted some version. I shouldn't say all, most, possibly all, I don't know which, but most, at least, of the states adopted some version of the UCC. They may have tweaked it individually, so it's not necessarily going to be identical in every state, but overall, the general rules so that my check can be cashed in New Jersey and my brother's check can be cashed in New York, and obviously lots of other more complex transactions can go forth under generally the same rules. It's like speaking the same language. If you either already know you have a statutory issue or you discover it, as we did with our ERISA question, you really want to focus your research around the statute first. Now, let's not say go to the statutes first, because, of course, like our ERISA question, you really want to go to the secondary sources first. But you want to explore the statutory aspect first. And I say first as opposed to going to the case law first. I can't tell you how many law students, recent grads, because you usually talk about cases in class, which makes sense for the particular classes. Your first thought is you think researching the law, or not you, but some people think researching the law is researching the cases, because that's what you talk about in law school. Well, if it's a statutory issue, you're really better off focusing on the statutory aspect. Again, I would say start in secondary sources, because certainly for our ERISA question, I wouldn't have wanted to start with the ERISA statutory section. We'll be looking at that next time. I want to start in the secondary source and figure out what on earth is going on, that the section exists, what does it do, are we preempted? But I want to focus in the statutory realm rather than doing the case research. You have to do the case research, but don't start there. And you want the challenge with researching statutes, especially diving in to Lexis or Westlaw, going into the code part or doing your research and then filtering down to the code, is that the language in statutes, unlike judicial opinions, is it's called controlled vocabulary. It's very narrow. The Congress, the state legislatures pick and choose their words very carefully, and they may not be the words that you think of. And in fact, what we are going to see is that this actual statutory section that is the ERISA preemption section doesn't use the word preemption. We've been talking about ERISA preemption as the shorthand now since like all semester, right? But if we were to go into looking for the preemption section, or the actual U.S. Code section that talks about preemption, we wouldn't find it. And again, because of using of that very specialized language. So when you're sitting down doing keyword searching, you want to think about that, which is one reason why you really need to use secondary sources. It's another reason to use some of the tools that we'll be talking about in the annotated code, like the table of contents. Okay, any questions? So keep this chart handy. As I mentioned, the link is here in our class web links, and again, rather than a handout, it's in the web links because it's a web page, and you will see sources of the law down here. We will be referring back to it next time, so if you can remember to bring it, I will have the tab up as well. And we're now going to start our discussion of federal statutes specifically. We'll be talking about federal statutes the next couple of classes. We'll talk about state statutes, and then we'll do a review. And we're spending more time on federal statutes mostly because even though you'll probably be spending, some of you will be spending more of your time researching state law in your careers, is that it works the same way, and at least federal is a unified thing for us to look at. States have different names and numbering systems. But we'll talk about that when we talk about state laws. And again, understanding the process will help you understand not only what you are looking at when we look at either state or federal codes, excuse me, but it'll also, if you understand the process and understand what the names are, it will make legislative history, when we talk about that in a couple of weeks, a whole lot easier. Okay. So what we're going to talk about is the story of how a federal law comes to be and is published. And that's what the other handout for today is. And this particular handout is not a web page, it's just under our handouts link. Okay, so once upon a time, our president, the House and Senate, each passed a version of legislation. They agreed on it, and they sent it to the president's desk, and he signed it. It became a law. We'll talk about that whole process before it becomes the law when we talk about legislative history. But right now we are starting our story with the law having been passed. So again, as I mentioned before, law doesn't really get passed until the president signs it. If he vetoes it, then obviously it has to go back to the House and go through the whole supermajority vote and all of that. But let's assume it's passed. So the first thing that happens, as we saw with ERISA, is it gets assigned a number. And as I mentioned, that number has meaning. So our buddy ERISA, its number is 93406. What the number means is, and why it's significant, the first number, the 93, tells us ERISA was passed in the 93rd Congress. And the 406 just means it was the 406th piece of legislation to have passed, not to have been introduced. There are many, many more that are introduced that never go anywhere. But it's a 406 to have passed. That second number is less significant. It's the first number that's significant because that tells us the Congress number. Remember, I talked about legislatures meeting, and when they meet for a period of time, that period of time is called a session. It's a legislative session. In Congress, the legislative session actually lasts 2 years. Because, anybody guess why? And this is not totally transparent, but you might know. Because the House of Representatives sits for 2 years. And remember, so their term is 2 years. So every 2 years, you get to elect or re-elect your House of Representative member. Okay. So to give you a sense, I hope. So here's congress.gov. We'll be coming back to this site a whole lot. There's a lot of whole great legislative material on congress.gov. For now, what we are looking at are the lists of current public laws. And by current, I mean the laws passed in this Congress. This Congress, by the way, is the fighting 114th Congress, which actually started in January, because remember, we just had an election, a congressional election, so a bunch of senators whose 6-year terms expires, and of course all of the House of Representatives. So we can see actually here the very first law back in January for the 114th Congress has the number 114-1, and it has to do with the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. Now, what we see below are actually public laws from the prior Congress, and you can see that it's 2013-2014 as opposed to 2015, and you can see the public law number 113-295. So I can surmise from this that there were 295 public laws passed in the 113th Congress. So for between January 2013 and December 2014, there were 295 laws passed. And that's not an important fact for you to know. That's just to help you understand the concept of a 2-year Congress and that the 2-year Congress is numbered. Another way to understand that is to look here at at another website. And by the way, all these links are in the class web links statutes folder, since we're now talking about statutes. You can actually see this table that tells us, excuse me, I apologize, the years for each Congress. So as we've just been talking about, 114th Congress started in January 2015, the 113th started in January 2013. Scroll down and randomly choose a Congress. So the 93rd Congress, okay, not so random because remember ERISA is 93-406. So the 93rd Congress started here in January of 93. And then this 1-2, by the way, is first session, second session, because it's 2 years, each year is a session. You don't really have to worry about this session number. That typically doesn't have much significance. But just know that a Congress lasts 2 years, and that when you see that public law number, that first number tells you what Congress it is. And then you can try to figure out what the year. There's no sort of easy way of doing that. Best to hopefully just find the year already in whatever information you're reading. Okay. So, as we've already talked about, public law is abbreviated public PL. You'll sometimes hear public laws referred to, as we already talked about, generically session laws, but sometimes also slip laws. That's a reference to back in the old-fashioned days when there was just paper and public laws got distributed in paper and they looked something like that. Have you heard of slip opinions? Okay, so the same sort of nomenclature, slip opinion, again, back in the old-fashioned days when cases were only issued in paper, they first came out as a slip opinion in a sort of folded over 8x11 format with staples here on the side and the opinion printed out. So slip law is the same. So if you hear that term, we're really referring just to a session law. And if it's in the federal world, a public law, because again, public law is the federal term for a session law. Okay, as we already talked about, public laws are published officially in statutes at large, abbreviated STAT. Again, you want to understand that abbreviation. And unofficially in USCAN. I'll talk about more about USCAN when we talk about legislative history. And again, they are published in chronological order. So in USCAN, since it's published by year, you will have in the first volume of USCAN for the 93rd Congress, 93, Public Law 93-1, statutes at large. So here's the 93rd Congress. This is the second session. Remember I said since it's 2 years, there are 2 sessions, so this won't start at 93-1. It will start somewhere in the middle. But again, remember that public laws, session laws, wherever they're published, are published chronologically. And that to find them, again, as we said, for statutes at large, because it's just a random volume number, you just need the statutes at large cite, just like for a case, you need the citation. You can't just you could flip through, but it would take too long. For USCAN, you need the public law number, because again, there's no random volume number. It's just by year and then by public law. Okay, and as we've already talked about, sections of the public law, again, as public law reflects the sections as exist on the particular date that it was passed, whether it's 1974 or our Public Law 114-1 back in January, those sections are separated out by subject and put in the U.S. Code. And we'll be looking at the U.S. Code in much more depth next time, as well as USCA, the annotated versions, USCA and USCS. Okay, so let's go back to our public law, our ERISA public law one more time. And notice here what statute, since this is a PDF from Statutes at Large, what it's doing. In the right, we are having these little notes that are letting us know, hey, if you're interested in this particular section, so this short title and table of contents is actually in 29 USC 1001 in the note, actually, because it's just what the name of the... Let's scroll down a bit here so you can see something a little more significant. So here's Section 3 of the public law, and this little column, margin note is telling us that, okay, you're interested in Section 3, which is the definition section, which, believe me, you're interested in, and we'll talk about that as well. You'll find this great definition section in Title 29 of the U.S. Code, Section 1002. And here's another reference. Whatever particular reference is made here, you'll find this in this particular title and section of the U.S. Code. And that goes on throughout. Now, they didn't always do that with this statutes of large, give you those little right margin notes, but this is back in 1974, and as you can see, they're doing it there. So what I'm scrolling down to, actually, is that going to work? Actually, let's scroll back up. So we can see that what the different sections are in the table of contents. And as it turns out, and for the moment you'll have to take my word for it, but I will explain how you would figure this out on your own in the next couple of classes. Turns out our preemption section was originally enacted by ERISA back when ERISA was initially enacted in 74 by Section 514 of our public law. So Section 514 of Public Law 93-406. Again, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you intentionally because, again, you need to understand what each one means. So Section 514, and as I mentioned to you, Section 514 isn't called preemption, it's called effect on other laws. Pretty random and generic, and when we take a closer look at it, we will see why it's called that. But if we scroll down, and I'll see if I can find this without taking too much time. I wonder if it's going to let me do that. We'll see if it's going to let me do this. PDFs, I'm never confident, lets me do Control F. Oh, that's not going to work, is it? No, this is Section 501, so this won't take too long. $513, we're getting there. Ta-da, 514, effect on other laws. And so we find out in these margin notes, 29 U.S.C. 1144, again, if you take my word that that's the preemption section, that that's where we would find it in the U.S. Code. Obviously, it took me a lot of time to find that scrolling through, and of course, assuming we already know Section 514. So if you were to get a public law section reference, and actually you probably will, because for whatever reason, I don't understand the reason, the media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, when they refer to a section of an act, they don't refer to the code section, they refer to the act, the Public Law Act section. And I say act meaning the Employee Retirement Security Act. So if for whatever reason the New York Times writes about preemption, it would refer to ERISA Section 514. Now, of course, ERISA Section 514, you look in the original ERISA, it was back in 1974. It's probably been changed. So there is a table. If you already know your public law number, you can find the translation. And it's actually a nice illustration of the fact that you need to make that translation if you get you need to know whether or not you're getting a public law section number or a U.S. Code section number. And if you are getting a public law section number, then you need to make the translation. So, and again, this link is in the class web links under statute folder. So if we know that we are interested in ERISA, we would need to know the year, and then we would need to know the public law number, and I'll show you in just a moment what happens if we don't know all those numbers. So we know it's 93-406. And ta-da, here's our translation table. So remember we saw that section 1, the name was in the Title 29 of the U.S. Code, 1001 note. Section 3, I think, was the definition section of the public law. Section 3 of the public law is in Title 29, Section 1002 of the U.S. Code. And scrolling down to what is now our favorite section, 514, again, we can see it's in Title 29, Section 1144. So there is this translation table. And again, this link will be in the class web links. Now, of course, I just threw at you a whole lot of numbers. I told you 514, I told you 93406. You look in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they're certainly not going to tell you the public law number. Nobody wants to read that in the popular press, right? But they will tell you, oops, that's not exactly where I go. They will tell you the name of the act. They might mention ERISA, or they might mention the Voting Rights Act or Civil Rights Act, any of the many acts that get discussed in the press. So there is another table that will help you out. They'll probably actually use more than that translation table, and that's called a popular name table. Now I should mention the codes have these popular name tables in print as part of them, typically a separate volume. But this day and age, no one's going to be fighting through those volumes or coming all the way to the library because we now have this online. And actually, if you typed in popular name table in Google, you might want to include U.S. code or federal, but you'd pull it up eventually, even without having the link in our class web links. And essentially, a popular name table is what it sounds like, whatever the name of the act is. So we know our name of our act is ERISA, so if I weren't already in the E's, I would click on the E. What I might do, because you've watched me scroll more than enough already, is again do another Control F and look for, ERISA. And actually it's going to do what indexes always do to us. It's going to refer us somewhere else, Employee Retirement Income Security. So rather than look in ER, I have to look under EM. So, okay. So EM. So I'm going to type enough till it pulls it up, and sure enough, Employee Retirement Income Security Act, if we hadn't already known it, because I hadn't already told you, which is going to be most of the time, you now know it's Public Law 93-406, so you know that it was originally passed in the 93rd Congress. Here's the date, here's the Statutes at Large site. We already have seen quite a bit. And it even tells us at least where it starts, 29 U.S.C. 1001. So again, that short title. And the neat thing is, if I click on the public law number, it brings up that table that we were already looking at. So I don't have to know the public law number as long as I know the popular name and know to start in the popular name table. So again, I like this table because it reminds us of the difference between the Act sections and the U.S. Code section, and in fact that there is no sort of logical explanation as to the numbering between the Act and the Code. So here, Section 2 is Section 1001 in Title 29, and our 514 is 1144. So don't expect any Section 2 in one is going to be Section 2 in the other. Not at all the case. Maybe coincidentally once in a very great while. So again, if you're only getting the reference to the Act, you want to use the translation to get to the Code. And I will show you next time how you get from the Code back to the public law number, because that's something you'll need to do for legislative history research, but we won't get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so we're talking about the sections of the public law separated by subject, which we've talked a lot about. Again, that's the one concept I'm hoping you're going to walk out understanding, and put into the United States Code, codified, again, that fancy word. U.S. Code is official, U.S. Code annotated, U.S. Code service unofficial. They're annotated We will see why they are our friends next time. We've seen how to translate either using the table if we already know the public law number, or the popular name table if we only have the popular name. The translation table, by the way, is referred to as Table 3. No idea why. That's just how it's referred. And I, again, know that difference between public law and U.S. Code sections. And in the handout I mentioned the two tables I've just talked about. That is all I have, other than to again remind those of you who have not sent me your exam schedule to do so. And if you could bring both of these handouts next time, you might find them useful. Any questions? Okay, I will see you on Thursday then. Take my books back.